This is question 2 from section 1 of the 2014 BMAT, and in this question we're asked for the main conclusion of the argument. So let's remind ourselves we're asked for the main conclusion. That's often a solution or reaction to a problem, is often a should-type statement. Let's see if any of those apply in this passage. So first one it says it's common to think that carnivores, i.e. meat eaters, are at a higher risk of extinction than non-meat eaters because they're at what it calls the precarious top of the food chain. So some of these precarious if it's kind of unstable or dangerous. So it's kind of suggesting if at the top of the food chain you depend on the animals below you, the things you eat, or the things eaten by the things you eat. And maybe if those things change, then you kind of topple off your position on the top, and that would make you extinct. But this is something it's saying other people think, rather than the writer themselves. And in the next sentence, they actually say they disagree with that. So their actual position is herbivores have probably been at a high risk of extinction across history. So when they say this is probable, we'll see they kind of base that on this evidence. This is what they're saying they think is most likely based on the evidence they're about to give. So that basically makes it their opinion. And often when they disagree with something other people say, it's them giving their opinion. And then if we look at the next two sentences, they say herbivores, so non-meat eaters, are specialised in the environment and foods they're adapted to, while carnivores have broadly useful features, and they list their generous teeth so they can use them in multiple ways, and their agility and their good senses. So these are just facts about herbivores and carnivores. And then they say all these things make carnivores less vulnerable to changes in the environment. So that's again just a fact about carnivores. And lastly, they say that meat is always meat in any environment. So basically, carnivores can eat anything made of meat rather than herbivores which eat particular plants. And they say a grassland changing to a forest, for instance, would be a problem for grazers. That's just showing that herbivores can be vulnerable to changes in the environment. And these are, again, just sort of scientific facts. So if we're looking for the main conclusion, it kind of looks like it's going to be this sentence because it's a non-factual one. And actually that makes sense because they've laid out the position they disagree with, so it makes sense that them stating their own position, which is the opposite of that, is their conclusion, and everything else is a reason for that. So is there any other candidate for a conclusion? Well, sentences 3 and the start of sentence 4 are just purely factual evidence. And sentence 5 is kind of just an illustration of that. So 4b kind of is an intermediate conclusion because it is basically saying because carnivores have more broadly useful features, that's what makes them less vulnerable to changes in the environment. But could that be the main conclusion? Well, no, it kind of seems like it's being used to argue for the fact that carnivores are at a lower risk of extinction. Because if they're less vulnerable to changes, that would make them less likely to go extinct. So it looks like the structure of the argument is they give this evidence and then they draw this intermediate conclusion, and then this is their main conclusion. And to summarise the argument, they're basically saying herbivores are more specialised, and so that makes them more vulnerable to environmental changes, and that's what puts them at high risk of extinction. So let's have a look at the options and see if any of them correspond to herbivores being at a high risk of extinction or carnivores being at a lower risk of extinction. Well, if we look at option C says exactly that. It says herbivores have a high risk of extinction. So it looks like that is our conclusion. Let's just see where the other options come from, why they're not the conclusion. So A says herbivores are more threatened by changes in the environment, i.e. carnivores are less threatened by changes in the environment. And does that correspond to part of the argument? Yes, it corresponds to this intermediate conclusion, the second half of sentence 4. Option B is that it's natural to think that carnivores have a higher risk of extinction. Well, that sounds a lot like how they introduced their argument, but that's just what other people say, and that's what they disagree with. We look at option D, it says carnivores are better at adapting to environmental changes. So that is something the writer says, but that's a reason for carnivores to have a low risk of extinction, whereas it's not something that follows from carnivores having a low risk of extinction. So that's just a reason that's given, it's not the conclusion. That basically corresponds, it's very similar to option A actually. And option E is that carnivores are most successful mostly because they've got more generalist adaptations. Like it lists their teeth and agility and good senses. So it does mention those generalist adaptations, but doesn't actually say that that's why they're successful. Not exactly. It says that's why they're more resistant to changes in environment. So that's one benefit. But it doesn't say that's the main reason they're successful. So this is just something the writer hasn't actually said. And so it can't be their conclusion. Although even if they had said this, it would be a reason for the conclusion rather than the conclusion itself. So in any case, we see that our answer, again, is C.